Hi, Karen Alari here. Let's paint this little summer river scene today. Here's your supply list, and we're going to start off with a toned canvas. I used a yellow-orange color. You want it to be nice and thin. And now let's start by mixing up our secondary colors. I'm mixing a green here with Pthalo blue and Hansa yellow opaque. You notice how I laid out my colors this time, with the primaries in the four corners, and then I'm mixing by going directly across and mixing the two colors between the primary colors. Just a new way to keep it kind of more organized. There's our orange with Napthol red and our Hansa yellow, and then we're going to do a dark purplish color with the Napthol red and our Pthalo blue. Titanium white is our last color, and we're all ready to go. Let's start by doing a little basic drawing. Doesn't matter what color you use. I'm using a small round brush to do this. We're not going to do any kind of detail here. We're just giving ourselves a road map. Where are the big shapes located? So we got a big shape of the water, and then a big shape that are these rocks along the shoreline, and then there's a few rocks right in the front there. And I'm just sketching them in real loosely, sketching in the main part where the water is going to be having little wavelets, and then the background where the upright trees start and the edge of that grassy area. That's all we need, just a really simple road map. So now I'm switching to my number 6 flat brush here. But you just want a slightly larger brush at this point. You don't want to use a real small brush. It could be even larger than the one I'm using here, maybe an 8 or a 10. This is an 8 by 10 canvas, so it's not super big. What I'm doing here is just laying in the darks. This part of the painting is called the block-in. So we're not really going for detail or being exact about anything. We're just getting our eye focused on the values in the painting. Where are the darkest darks, and where are the lightest lights, and where are your midtones? So that's what I'm putting in here. There's a lot of very light stuff here where the water is bubbling up, and there's some light sides to these rocks. So that's all I'm doing. I'm not even worrying about color. I'm just thinking about value. So we've got light and dark. And the background of the toned canvas kind of stands in for a mid-tone. Here I mixed up kind of a mid-gray, mostly because it got on my brush just from having white on my brush and then mixing into those dark rocks that I already put. Okay, now we're going to take some Pthalo blue and some of our Napthol red and some of our green, and let's throw some orange in there too. I'm just making a mid-tone that's kind of the watercolor, just basically. So you notice that water is a really unique color. This is the North Umpqua River in Oregon, and it has this very characteristic blue-green tint to the water, which is so beautiful. So I got that by starting with the blue, but then adding some red, some green. You're basically neutralizing that color a little bit. You don't want to use this straight bright blue from your tube because it would be too overwhelming. So I added a little more yellow to it and got a little greener version of that. And now I'm mixing up mid-tone green for that background, those background trees. And again, I'm thinking about value and big shapes here. I'm not thinking about exact color, and I'm not thinking about shapes, putting in the trees, putting in the leaves, putting in the rocks. I'm just trying to train my eye to really see those values, because it's the values in your painting that are really going to make or break it. If you get those right, you can fudge a little bit on the color one way or another. But if your values are wrong, the picture just won't make sense. Think of it in terms of if you turned your painting into black and white, just went into a photo program and made it black and white, you want it to still be able to read. You want to know what you're doing, and you want your viewer to be able to see what the image is without even needing the color. I've switched over to a number 4. This is a bright brush, but it could be a flat. Flats and brights are interchangeable. They're both squared off on the end, but a flat has longer bristles than a bright, and that's the only difference. So now that I've finished that basic block in of the colors, I'm coming back and starting to think now more about shape. So I'm developing the painting by, again, starting with my darkest darks there, but now I'm actually looking at my reference and trying to match those shapes and values and colors. This reference that we're using here is just a tiny crop out of a painting that I did, and that's kind of fun to use a crop to paint from. I've found that oftentimes when I finish a painting, I probably chose too much to put in the painting, and I could have gotten across what I was trying to say just by cropping into one little area and making that area more significant. So I've been having fun lately with cropping up a lot of my older paintings into something that I think is a little more interesting. So I'm continuing to develop these rocks using variations, varying colors and values, but all kind of staying within these darker value shapes. Every time I go back to the palette, I like to pick up a slightly different shade, so you can end up with lots of different colors, which is a lot of fun. It adds interest and the impression of detail in your painting when you get a lot of slight variations of colors. I'm working more with the light side of the rocks, the sunlit side, but I've started with kind of a bit of a darker shades of grays and beiges, and I'm moving up into the lights. You can do that with acrylics because you can paint right over what you've already done, and it'll be dry enough that the paint will stick. So I'll start with the darks and then paint more of the lights and continue to add white and go even lighter. One thing I like to do when I add white to a color to make it more sunlit, I added a little bit of orange, just a touch of orange you could see in that. Or yellow, here's some yellow coming up. If you only add the titanium white to your color, it's going to get cooler and cooler. And sunlight is generally usually warm, not cool. And in this painting in particular, I'm making it warmer. So you want to think about when you're working with white, don't just add the white. Also add a little bit of red or orange or yellow, depending on what color you're working with, to warm it up a little bit. Just going back and forth with the lights and the darks, looking at my reference photo and just painting in what I see there. You can tell I've speeded up this video a little bit, and that's just so we get through it a little bit faster. I'm not this speedy of a painter. I tend to paint fairly slowly and kind of think about what I'm doing and enjoy the process. That is, after all, why I paint, because I just love the process of painting. Back and forth with those colors, so I'm starting with the dark and going to the light, but then I go back to the dark and I go back to the light, and I keep building up those layers until I get to what I like. Remember that acrylic paints are going to dry darker. So whatever you put in the light values especially, you're probably going to have to come back once or twice and lighten it up a little bit more. I always like to remind myself, if it looks too light, it's just about right. It's just kind of the way acrylics are, something to get used to. So we're using some yellow and some orange and some red, making a brownish color there, tannish color, but very much on the warm side, to add a little more warmth to these rocks. You know, painting rocks, like anything else you paint really, I think the key is to get yourself to where you're not thinking, oh, I'm now painting rocks, what do rocks look like? But instead, just look at your reference and just paint the shapes you see. Find the colors and the values and the shapes, and focus on just painting those shapes versus thinking about how to paint a rock per se. I think it's very helpful with anything you're painting to do that. When you get your brain in the way, it can kind of mess things up for you. Just use your eyes and let that information go directly from your eyes to your brush and paint what you see. And sometimes you're surprised after you look up, and after a period of painting shapes, you realize, oh, look, I painted a thing. But it is important to try to keep that brain out of it. Moving into the water now more, with that blue that's been neutralized with oranges and greens and reds, and starting with a darker version, and then coming in with some lighter tones. You notice how I'm using my brush. I'm using the very tip of the brush, and I'm moving it in horizontal strokes. I'm letting my brush feel the way the water is going to flow. So it's moving back and forth the way water moves. And that helps you get that feeling of movement in the water. Down in the front, there's a little more, it's a little shallower, and there's a little more movement, so the water is a little bit greener. And here I'm putting in, using that dark to put in the rocks that are under the water. There's some submerged rocks there, creating a little shelf, and that's what's creating all the white water, all of the little bubbling and waves and activity going on in the water is there because it's splashing over those submerged rocks. So because that blue was still a little bit wet, when I put in the dark, it could blend with the blue, and so it makes it look more like it's submerged and under the water. I'm painting around those rocks, giving them more shape by painting around them. That's called negative painting, and it's a great technique to practice and use, because you can get some really interesting shapes by using that technique. All right, come in with some lighter yellow-green for the water. Again, using my back and forth horizontal strokes. You know, people always talk about difficulty blending with acrylics, but you can do a lot of blending with acrylics as long as you move quickly and the paint is still wet and you put a lot of paint on your brush. I can't emphasize this enough, especially with beginners. Load up your brush with paint. Don't be stingy. Then you'll get those nice, thick, juicy brush strokes that will blend together and be easier that way. Okay, I've slowed the video down here a little bit. I think it'll be easier for you to see the techniques that I'm using to create the water splashes and the water effects. You notice I'm holding the brush very flat to the canvas and just skimming it along the surface. So I'm using some white and I'm laying it down on the canvas and then pushing upward to get those little splashes. So the splashes come from the paint pulling off onto the canvas in those upward movements. It gives the top of the splash a look kind of like a splash, right? But I'm holding my brush very loosely, and I'm pushing upwards, and then I'm dragging the bottoms so you can see the way that the water flows. I'm using my brush to describe the flow of the water, and I'm thinking about that as I'm painting it. I'm thinking about how the water's going to flow in ripples, and the splashes, the water's going to come across the top and then splash down over those submerged rocks that are there. Now I'm using a little bit of the somewhat darker colors. You don't want all of your white water to be white, basically. You want to use different variations of value, in some a little bit darker and some a little bit lighter, in order to give depth to your water. Here I'm using some slightly darker colors, which are blending in with the paint that's wet, and I'm adding a tiny bit of shade or shadow underneath those splashes as they go over. Again, trying to add depth and interest and layering to the water. So as you look, at a stream that's bubbling along, you'll see lots of different layers and different colors and different things going on, because it's such a dynamic subject. Take your time and look at your reference, and start to get that feel for the water. Where is it going? Which direction is it going? Where is it splashing? And every time I go back, I'm mixing up a slightly different color. So here I'm using that bluer blue, and I added more white to it. This is a case where I don't need to add more warmth to this color necessarily when I'm adding the white, because I'm staying in these cool water tones until I get to the very whitest whites. But right now I'm just trying to add depth by coming in and putting in lots of different swirls and shapes in the water going on. You have to be careful not to put too much of the lighter colors over the dark, or you'll lose the effect of the water. Okay, here's where I'm adding a tiny bit of orange to that white to warm it up a little bit, so you get that white that's in the sunlight but is also being affected by the warm light. You notice how I'm turning my brush. I'm using the flat, but I'm also rolling it so that I get the very corner of the brush to make the little tiny splash marks. You don't need to necessarily be switching back and forth your brushes all the time. You can just use this flat brush, use the corner of it, use the tip of it. It has lots of different marks that it can make, and it makes your life simpler when you're not trying to find the perfect brush all the time. Using that lightest white, thinking about the water flowing over the edge of that little shelf, so you get those vertical marks, horizontal ones on the top and then vertical. Here I am again with the splashes, pushing upward with my brush in order to get a splash mark. Looking at what I've done and deciding where it needs more splashiness. Something I do a lot while I'm painting is I squint my eyes. That helps you get sort of a distant image. Another good thing to do is just step back from your painting often. And a third way to do it is to put a portable full-length mirror behind you as you're painting, so that you can turn around and look at your painting in the mirror. That's really helpful. When you're right up on top of the painting, sometimes it's hard to see kind of hard to see the forest for the trees. You know, you get caught in the detail and you don't see how the overall picture is looking. And sometimes when you step back, you think, oh, no, I'm getting it. This is looking all right. But when you're close up, you're just seeing blobs of paint. So I really recommend squint your eyes, look in a mirror, or step back from your painting. I love to paint water. I could go on for hours and hours just painting the different swirls and enjoying the process. Looking at where the water is going to go. Okay, I went back to speeding up a little bit. I think you get the idea of the brush strokes. So now it's just a matter of putting down lots of them. And enjoying the process of painting. It's so easy to get caught up in, oh, I'm so worried about if this is going to turn out right, or who's going to see it, or maybe you have people coming through the room as you're painting and giving you unsolicited advice. But whatever that might be, try to let go of all that stuff and just enjoy the process. Enjoy those beautiful colors. Enjoy the way the paint flows onto the canvas. That's what it's all about, really, is that enjoyable, fun experience, tactile experience that you're having with the paint. And how it turns out and whether or not people like it, well, that's not really for you to worry about, right? I think my painting got a lot better when I stopped worrying about whether or not I was painting quote-unquote good paintings, but realized it's just a fun process. There's that phthalo blue with orange added, and then some of that blue with more green added. So basically I'm just mixing up some more of my paint colors, my watercolors. Adding the orange to the phthalo blue is adding a complementary color. So you're basically adding the other two primary colors. So you've got the blue, and then you add orange, which is made up of red and yellow. And so that complementary color is going to move your color more towards gray, right? If you combine all three of your primary colors, you're just going to get a muddy, dark gray color. So if you want to neutralize or gray down the color that you're using a little bit, you want to add those other two primaries, and the simple way to do that is to add the complementary color. So you're going to neutralize a green by adding red, you're going to neutralize a yellow by adding purple, and that's something that you use a lot. I use a lot. I don't tend to use black to gray down my colors because I feel like it dulls them too much. It makes them flatter and less interesting. But when you use the complementary color to gray it down, you get more lively mixtures. I don't even have black on my palette. As you see, I just have that dark that we mixed using our phthalo blue and our red. Okay, now I'm okay with the water for a while. I'm going to let it sit and dry. As you're painting, when the paint starts getting thicker and thicker, you'll realize at some point you need to just let that dry and come back to it later so you don't just get big globby sticky messes going on down there. So I'm starting with some darker greens. You saw me take that green and mix in some of my dark purplish color here, because I'm focusing first on the dark areas of my reference photo. I want to get some nice trees up there, impression of trees, but the focus really in this painting is on the water, so I don't want to spend too much time or get too detailed. Remember, when you're watching this, you can always go into the settings and slow it down if you want to see a little more specifically my brush strokes. Notice as I'm putting in these tree shapes how I flip my brush over, so kind of paint with one side and then flip it over, paint with the other side, paint with the corner. And that's what gives me those variety of shapes. Painting around this rock to shape it, using that negative painting again. I use paper towels to wipe off my brush in between. If the color is really similar, I don't even worry about rinsing the brush and introducing more water into the brush. I just wipe it off with the paper towel. And then after, when I do rinse it, I will dry it off before I go into my paint. You want to keep your paint nice and thick using these kind of techniques. You don't want any water in your paint. Added a few tree trunks in there, and then I'm going back over them. You notice I just kind of did them in a dark tone. They're not necessarily brown. You want to well, watch your reference photo, but generally tree trunks aren't really brown. They're all kinds of different grays and light colors and purples and blues and greens, but very seldom are they what we would consider a brown. Again, painting around those rocks to create the shape. Thinking about creating variety in the shape of the rocks. Got lots of paint on my brush, and I'm just bringing in that nice light green value, made with green, more yellow. Now I'm adding a little orange to it to warm it up a little bit and get a slightly different shade of green. That's the thing about greens, that there are so many different shades that you can use. So again, I'm trying to stay very loose. You notice how I'm holding my brush. I'm not holding it like a pencil. I'm holding it loosely in my fingers and my thumb. That gives you more ability to flip the brush over in different directions. And also it helps you keep loose and get loose marks on the canvas there. Creating some little brush-like areas coming up. Thinking about the light and where the direction it's coming from. The light's coming more from the left to the right, so kind of the left sides of those areas. Getting some slightly darker under the pushed up edge of the grasses that I made there. Getting some shadow under the trees. Every time I go back, I try to vary that color a little bit. Mixing some of the darker into the lighter to get a color that's in between. If you're having trouble with feeling like your edges of between colors are too sharp, then one way to do it is just to mix the two colors together and create a little bit of that third color. You notice I spritzed my paints with a little spritzer bottle with water in it. That helps keep them wet during the process of painting. I am using a Stay Wet palette here, but I've got regular palette paper on it, not the Stay Wet palette paper, which keeps the paints a little more moist than the regular palette paper does. So I'm using a lighter version of our dark purple. You noticed I put in some tree trunks, and now I'm putting in some kind of a pathway area, maybe. Kind of break up that horizontal line of the grass by introducing a little bit of a path coming forward. Adding a little more yellow to that purple, which is the complement, and it's going to neutralize it a little more. And that was starting to go a little brown, so I added blue. Whenever your color is looking too brown and you want to go more for a gray, blue is the color that you want to add to go from brown to gray, which makes sense when you think about it, because brown is a kind of an orange, and blue is going to neutralize your orange. Back into the rocks with that gray, mid-tone gray. You can see it's almost the same value as the palette paper I've got in there, which is a mid-tone gray. Taking a little time to think about which way I'm going with this. Deciding I need some warmer browns for that path. I like the idea of it, so I'm going to develop that a little bit more. Whenever you introduce a color, a new color into your painting, you want to be sure to add that color at least in a few other spots, so it's not isolated. But here I'm using it to restate the light values in the rocks. And then I'm going to come back with some of my darkest dark. As these rocks have dried, so now I'm thinking about them and sort of just reevaluating where the dark shadows are, those shadows on the right sides. Painting around those splashes that I've already put in the water, so I don't lose them entirely, but instead having that nice dark behind that splash area will give it more emphasis. There's a more yellowy green. So really what I'm thinking about is my eye is wandering over the canvas, and any area that kind of stands out to me, I'm working on that area. Since I have all the basic elements in there, I could technically stop at this point, and you know what you're looking about. We've got the water, we've got the trees, we've got the grass, we've got the rocks. So now I'm just refining. I'll be using smaller and smaller shapes and doing a lot more thinking in between. Adding some of those green areas onto the rocks, that very yellowy green, to make some of the rocks look like they had some moss on them. Now a little bit more of bright yellowy greens back in the background to create more texture. Again, as that paint dries, the lights are going to start kind of blending in and disappearing, so then you need to go back in and restate them. Adding a little orange to that. So I want to keep those lighter greens, I want to keep them warm. I don't want them to go dull. So many different colors you can see in a little scene like this. You sit by the side of a river and just contemplate all the different colors in nature. It's really amazing, fascinating to watch. Making myself a little bush, a lighter bush. It's going to be darker on the bottom and have some little places where it's getting the light as it comes forward. I always think about those shapes, that they're not flat two-dimensional shapes, but that they're rounded. So you're going to have areas that come forward and areas that recede back, and you can do that with your lights and your darks. Going back in with some darker darks, just adding blue to it so that they're very blue dark. So I really want to get some depth into those trees. And I'm going to do that with adding more darks and more lights. That's going to give us our depth. And you notice I'm making that a blue-green, not a black necessarily. I want the darks to be interesting. You don't want your darks to go flat. Thinking about the shape of that tree and how lightening it up by painting in some of the background coming through the branches of the tree. And it's just you build up those layers and do a few and then try some more. If you put down just a few brush strokes and it doesn't look right, don't panic and don't give up. Because with acrylics you can just keep layering. Just the same way with the water, that I was thinking about the way the water flowed when I was doing my brush strokes, is the same way I'm doing the trees. Think about the way the branches grow and kind of make the movement of your brush mimic the movement of the growth of the trees. If that makes any sense at all. Alright, going lighter, adding more yellow to try to get some really bright highlights. And you notice how I'm putting them in the middle because I'm thinking about that branch projecting outwards, and so catching the light more because it's a branch that's coming outwards. Think about those forms being created. A little bit more of that lighter color on the ground as well, where the sun is hitting it. You want to overall keep those background trees a little bit warmer, a little bit darker than you have the ground. Think about the ground being a flat plane, so it's getting hit by the sun directly, and then the trees are upright, so it's only those projecting branches that are getting some direct sunlight like that. You want to keep the overall look of the background darker. And remember too, though, those lights are going to dry darker. Lightening up those lights on the rocks, putting in a few more of the rocks on the edges there. Slowing down quite a bit here because I'm thinking about what is capturing my eye, what's catching my eye and making me think there's something not quite right there. Don't know what it is, but it's not quite right. I'll oftentimes come in and simplify the shapes that I've made. If the rocks get too busy, you can just paint over. These are all nice and dark, dry now, so that you can paint right over what you've got before. Getting some big value contrast right there where the water's splashing up. Wherever you have a big contrast in value, lights against dark, that's where our eye is going to tend to go first. So you want to put those greatest value contrasts in your area of interest or your focal point. Even though this is all, we have the basic three elements of water, rocks, trees, and it's all kind of a horizontal shapes going on with a few verticals. That can get really boring if you don't have one area that has more interest than the rest of the areas. Adding blue to my brownish colors up there. See how that took it directly into a gray. Mid-tone gray. So I put those darks in, the shapes that I liked a little better, and now I'm thinking about the shadow side of the rocks. Always got to keep in mind your light source and direction so that you can create those forms more believably. My lightest lights there, the light warm yellowish colors versus the light cool grayish colors, so you get variety in those rocks. You don't want all the rocks all the way across to look like they're the same color, because rocks don't really do that. usually. Sometimes you can get in an area where the rocks are all the same. Down here at the water's edge, I've got a few more rocks. So I'm finishing up here. We're at the end of what I'm going to do for today. I can't see any more little places that are grabbing my eye specifically and making me worry about it. So I'm going to set it aside for a while. Okay, well, we've let this sit for a while and considered where we stand with it. And there's a few things that I want to adjust. So we've got, well, we'll just go through them as we go. I've got a nice long list of them here. But I think the primary one is I don't feel like it has a focal point. There's the eye kind of moves in, starts to move in here. But when we get beyond that, there's no real anything that kind of draws the eye and has a nice contrast. So I think what I'm going to do is create in this area, we kind of have it started with these very light splashes against the dark shadow in the rock. So I think I'm just going to expand on that and have this area have some larger rocks with some darker shadows and then create a larger splash in this area. But another issue that I have is that this water is moving from left to right. It's coming here and splashing down over these submerged rocks. But up here, it kind of looks like it's moving from right to left. And so I've got to figure out a way to create this splash area, but it's got to move that direction. So I might add some more submerged rocks right in here and bring them up, bring the water level up a little higher on this side so they can be coming in and splashing over and then splashing up. So that's the idea there. I just need a few more highlights in here in the rocks, and I need some areas in the water maybe with a little bit of darker depth. And then I'm thinking I might bring in some warmer tones in here in the water being shallower over here, so we get more of a contrast of dark and light instead of the water being kind of all one value or similar value. Anyway, that's the plan. Maybe a little more detail up here in the variety of the trees, maybe a few lighter sticks and twigs. We'll see how that goes. But the primary thing is to create that focal point. So I'm going to continue with my number 4 flat here. And I'm going to start with creating these rocks that are a little bit bigger and a little bit more shadowed. So I'll go straight into my dark here. And I don't want the splash focal point to be in the center. I want it to be on the third. So about a third of the way over. So about right in here is where I want the splash to be. And for that to happen, then the water level has to come up here. We have to have some submerged rocks in here for it to be splashing over to get out. And hopefully that will, maybe if this water level doesn't dip back there also, it might feel more like the water is going from left to right. So we'll start with that. Now I've got just my simple purple black there. And let's get one that's a little more blue, a little lighter, just to bring some of these lighter water tones in here. The water kind of reflecting into those deep shadows. Add a little bit of that over here so it doesn't become isolated and you don't know why it's there. I like this blue. I know I need a little more dark shadows in the back and variety in the back over here, so I add some of that in here just for fun. It might be too much, but we'll see how that goes. Okay, so there's some darker shadows in there. Now we have to create the shape of that rock. I want the rock to come also up a little higher here. So I got kind of a straight line where the rocks are. So maybe if these over here have one rock that's up a little higher, it might be helpful. Let's bring in some of these warmer yellow, orange, brownish tones for the light side of this bigger rock. This is the time of day here is pretty close to midday. So it's not, I'm not getting really directional light. The light isn't necessarily coming low or anything. It's like right up here. So it's coming to on the left side, but it's really high in the sky, which isn't necessarily the most interesting time of day to paint, to use as you're painting, but I'm not really good at getting up earlier in the morning or staying up late at night. So my paintings tend to kind of be that way. Midday paintings. All right. Let's do maybe some lighter brownish blue, just mixing that brown into the blue there. Get some of these tones hitting the water, maybe light reflecting up from the water into the rocks. That's kind of interesting. But I do want to keep this area dark in there so I can create my splashes. And I don't need to get very complex with those shapes, I don't think. Maybe I do, because it is the focal area. So let's see, at least we get some cooler light tones. So we get the feeling of these rocks being all different kind of rocks. Don't want to get too fussy though. Sometimes at this stage in the painting, I actually get rid of some of the fuss by doing, just simplifying my shapes a little bit. But that looks pretty interesting. Got the light coming over. We'll let it dry for a minute and then come back with some lighter lights up there. And let this dry so I can put some splashes up against it. And then we'll see if it's too much, but I kind of like it so far. So I wanted to do some darker tones in the water. And our water was this blue that's been neutralized a little bit with orange, our mixed up orange. So let's put a little more of that mixed up orange, a little of our dark, get some darker things in there because I want to have some more submerged rocks in here. And the water level is going to come up a little higher. And that's starting to feel more like it's moving left to right to me. And then I'm just going to add a few more. And here it's going to be the darkest. So the deepest and darkest. So I'll add some darks in there. That might be kind of interesting. And it's pretty deep in here, but I want to kind of create also a line with sort of the interest going up here. Let's maintain some of that splashes. Come in there. Maybe that's interesting. Let's add some more green to that. Some more yellow. Some more white. Get back to some of our lighter tones and blend this out a little bit so it's not completely. I want to keep those edges soft is my point. don't want to get too harsh with that, but I just creating that little bit more depth, maybe in here. Some of that darker. It's blending in so it's not as dark now. It might be too much. I'm going to come in with this lighter. Just make it a little bit bluer. A crazy Umpqua blue in here. Keep that. I'm going to keep that darkerness there. But it does bring a little bit of interest, I think. Like that. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. And got this coming in here. I want to get this darker rock color under there for the submerged rocks to bring my splashes over. Bring that in there. More of this submerged rock. It's kind of a shelf. The water is falling down. So that works pretty good. Okay. Let's see. It's towel. It's almost dry enough there to work on the splashes, but let me do a little bit of this submerged rock stuff here in this sort of warm bluish greenish that you get when the rocks are underneath the water. Let's try this. 2 green and 2 dark, a little more orange. Let's try that. Let's put a tad of green in there. Might have been too much. I just said it was too green and then I added more green. Let's pull this off here. Yeah, I don't hate that. It's a little bit going on there, and then let's bring it orange. A little more orange and a little lighter. So the rocks have some form. Some are submerged deeper and some are closer to the surface. Don't cover up all the dark, but just some of it to give those rocks a little more. And then maybe this blue with just a little bit of this in here to be around here. Let's see how we like that. That's looking pretty submerged rocky, isn't it? Okay. So a little variety, little warmer up here, a little shallower, a little warmer. And then we'll add maybe a few ripples over those rocks as we go. Let's put a few lighter highlights on the rocks. Somewhere in here, use that submerged rock color with a little more orange and a little more white to restate some of these lights that tend to disappear and darken as it dries. Get some real light. I don't like to use pure light, and remembering the light's hitting the top, but it's also hitting the right side of things. Just a few. We'll do some of this warmer because we got rocks that are kind of a little bit warmer and some that are a little bit grayer. So some are going to this area is going to be more of our focal area again, so we can have more contrast in light and dark in there. And then going towards the edges, we don't really want to bring up too much tension. I like this rock back here, but it's kind of disappearing, so maybe if I add some highlights to it, it'll stand out a little more. Some warmer tones into it. Let's get a little bit of a rocky brownish color. Orange and blue. Too blue, a little more orange. So it's like a super warm color to go back here. Maybe this one in shadow is getting a little edge of it. Something like that. These are these warmer colors. So I might need to use some over here. Break up the shapes. The fun part of rocks is trying to keep some variety in your shapes. And it's super easy to start going really, having everything be the same. Super easy. Or not exactly the same, but sort of symmetrical. A little bit more to these above water rocks. And then right at the edge, where they're dark, of course, they're going to have some dark. At the edge where they're wet, not at the edge where they're dark. Okay. Don't want to fuss around too much with that, but I think that adds a little more contrast and some things that are, this one doesn't feel realistic with this big dark shadow up there. So I think I'm going to tone that shadow down a little bit. Let's make something a little bluer. It's really blue. Good old Pthalo. It's quite the bully, but I love its rich color. Okay. So here's some sort of mid-tone blue grays, which I like. I think I would see some of that, and then I can bring in some lighter, maybe a little more orange, because that titanium white is always going to cool that color off. So let's see. Like that. We're gonna have to go a little bit lighter yet. But let's use some of this mid-tone gray here and there. Be back here on this rock. Took out all its dark now. Okay. Don't want to get too fussy with the rocks, but I want some shapes that are going this way because I have a tendency to do that because I'm doing the light this way, then I'm not moving my brush around and getting shapes that are going that way. And that's important. So let's try this. Cooler shadow sides, warmer sunlit sides. That's the way that goes. You can reshape the rocks with negative painting by shaping around them if you like. And then I'm going to stop here, I promise. You can see how you could just go on forever with this stuff. Maybe a little more form in here where I've got my darks going on. I want to keep that nice and dark. Okay. Along the top of this, the sunlight is coming from above, so we would get top surface of this being lighter too. Okay, it's pretty good. Okay, I'm not gonna fuss with that. All right. So we've got the rocks a little bigger over there, a little variation in shape. Got our darker water and our shallower water. Now let's see if we can bring the water across there and have it splash into the dark. So let's get some more of our watercolor, blue and orange, white added. And first we're going to bring it over. It's also kind of shadowy in there, so I want to try to do something with that. Very, very, very lightly floating my brush along there to create a broken. I feel like this water line needs to come up here. In which case, I'm going to get it darker. Because right in the shadow of these rocks, the water's going to be very dark. Because it's going to be shadowed a little bit. That's my theory anyway. So if I do that, then I can come in with some lighter tones of that watercolor. Drag that along so it can splash over those rocks. Maybe right against the rocks. Create a little bit of ins and outs there. Okay, let's go a little lighter yet. See if we can create some splashes. And to do that, we need to make sure we've got a lot of paint we're working with. You can't make splashes with not much paint on your brush. It's got to be more paint on the brush. So let's see what we can do. Pushing up. Okay, to make some depth, I'm going to get some slightly yellow, orange, too much. Okay, more white. That area is, let me find a clean area. Too much. I want it to be light, but I want it to be slightly warm. Just using the corner of my brush. I could go to a smaller brush, but I really feel like the corner of the brush gives me as much of a small shape as I need. I'll bring some of that across, flowing with the water, thinking about that flow, the water coming across. Not sure why that water is splashing so hard right there. I think I need a rock that's going over. I need a be splashing into a rock. No, I just feel like this needs to come up a little more. Let's pull the water up a little more. Maybe if it was just some of these rocks come up a little bit. Now I use this light warm because it'll mix with what's on my brush. See if I can get a rock in there. Now that's kind of coming behind it. There should be a rock after it. Maybe I'm thinking about it too much. I think maybe that's all right. Let's bring the water over the top again. Oh, well, maybe one coming this way a little bit. Oh, okay. That's not bad. If it comes that way, then the splash is going to be in front here. I like to start the splashes with that slightly darker color so I can add a highlight on top. Let's bring that slightly lighter color, show the water coming over, and then coming up. It's really wet in here, a lot of paint. So if you go really flat, when you have a lot of wet paint, go really flat, you can sometimes get some to come off. And that's all wet, so it can blend and bring back that dark that's going over here. Shelf in the water. Ending it, keep it under the water. Maybe. All right. I think I want some slightly warmer light there. The way that water gets kind of greenish when it's got sunlight coming through it. Some of that in here. Starting to get pretty mucked up, so I might quit here soon. Might have to call it done. Okay, once it splashes like that, then it does come out and have a little lighter area around it. There's some variety, I guess. Some that's a little bluer. I love painting water. I think I've said that before. You can really go on forever creating little eddies and swirls and interesting things going on in the water. I'm just going to look for places where maybe I've got a harsh edge where I shouldn't. And I think I'll bring in some. See if I can get another version of a light. Got sort of a light peachy color, about a very light yellow color. You know how water kind of has all kinds of different colors in it. Let's see. Starts splitting the light up. Oh, wouldn't that be cool to be able to make a rainbow? I don't think I can do that, but pick up some of these bigger splashes. Be a little more natural looking. Huh. As if we can stop a splash in mid splash and see it only in photos, right? But some of this yellow to try to get some variety and depth in the color. Little places where the water flows over, comes up, greeny blues, greeny blue yellows. Right there. I don't know, I think that looks pretty good. All right, let's see. Taller rock, more focal point. I think that's pretty good. Okay, left, right flow of the water, that's good. Submerged rocks, foreground, lighter areas on rocks. The only thing left, I did a little more variety up there, maybe a touch more up there in the trees too. I like the way over here there's some more of our dark. Let's take our dark, come into this blue a little bit and break it up. They go around the tree trunk maybe. Maybe this one we will make it seem kind of shorter, that one longer. Bring in some, I think I want to bring in some lighter twiggy color. Okay, we have these kind of purple stuff back there in shadow. That's maybe branches or twigs or something, but it doesn't seem to ever hit the sunlight anywhere. Maybe if I use something in here, might make a little dry bush. Keeping in this, the most detail, we're drawing the eye up to the focal area. So maybe this is a good spot for some of this. Catch, like this color, kind of a purpley color. I don't know what that is. Something I like to do is use my little liner brush. It's the number 4 liner brush. And thin that out. I thin the water out when I'm using a liner brush. Makes it flow out of the brush more easily. Lightening and warming that color up, adding water. I might get you some few dried branches. Trying to stay loose. Just add some variety of shape. Don't want to overdo it, but paint is a very, very thin consistency, so that's about all you can do with it. But now see what I've done is made this kind of evenly spaced almost, and even height. I'm not sure what I want to do about that. Maybe put some she's ruining it. That's okay. It can all be fixed. Okay. That breaks that up a little bit. Let me bring in this light color. So I went over the edge of the rocks in some places, and I don't want to do that. Bring in some dark color on the back, this one. Reshape those grasses a little bit. Like I say, a lot of times what this is about is not making more detail, but simplifying things that got too fussy. Yeah, just shapes and colors, something different over here. Don't want to go too far into the edges again. You don't want to lead your viewer out of the painting in the front door and out the back door. That's not good. I think that kind of looks, I think these grasses could use right along in here. They don't have a shadow side. You take some green and dull it down, cool it down. I think I will switch to a small brush. This is just a small, this one's a bright, has a shorter bristles. Yeah, it's kind of an army drab. I don't really like this color. Let's get it a little more blue. Let's see if we can put a little bit of shadow down at the base of these. Look a little, we could put a little bit of this shadow colored grass in the shadow. That might be good. Have a little interest. Right? All right, not to get too fussy. That's something. Maybe this flat area that's in the dirt would have a little more light on it. Let's try this orangey peachy color. Just took a lot of green on my little brush. So let's come over here. There we go. Let's see. There's a little bit lighter. And brings the eye back, like there's a little path to the water there. Is it going to have to be a thing or not a thing? Because right now they're very, like, what the heck is that? So have a little more light to them. Looks like gargoyles at the gate there, one on either side. That's not good. Let's turn this one back into a rock. Get rid of the gargoyle on this side. And some greenish colors. Some pure yellow in there, that's not pretty. This rock has a dark side. It looks pretty good. Kind of wish my splashes were a little more interesting, but I think that looks pretty good. I think we kind of solved a lot of our issues that were bothering us. So there we go, our little sunny river scene. See you next time.